Across then to Tehran, speak to our correspondent Reza Sayar, who joins us from there. Reza, what's the reaction then in Iran to this kind of possible US optimism that we're starting to hear about?
Stuart, the streets of Tehran are behind me and no one is celebrating just yet. Frankly, the people of Iran have been disappointed so often, have been through so much over the past 3 or 4 decades that frankly, they're very disillusioned and cynical about this nuclear deal, about these negotiations in Vienna, and generally about the notion of politicians sitting around in a European capital and doing something that will benefit them in their economy. Even so, they're watching, they're waiting to see what happens in Vienna. We're, of course, talking about a nuclear deal that was left in disarray back in 2018 when then U.S. President Donald Trump took office, withdrew Washington from the deal and slapped Iran with scores of sanctions. When there was a new U.S. president in office, Joe Biden, the remaining signatories of the deal decided to get to Vienna and meet with Iran beginning last April in an effort to revive the deal, with Washington participating indirectly. Those talks lasted about 3 months. They stopped in June because of the Iranian presidential elections. They resumed back in December. But over the past few months, very little indication of any progress. Where we had seen progress was Iran's nuclear program. Over the past 2 or 3 years, Iran pushing forth with significant advancements using advanced centrifuges, enriching uranium in record pace, enriching uranium to 60% purity, all advancements that were clearly concerning to Washington and its allies. So why all of a sudden some optimism? Because we've seen some optimistic statements over the past week or so. Yesterday, the State Department saying that the deal is possible in these rounds of talks in Vienna. Iran's foreign ministry this week saying that there's been significant progress. Perhaps the most optimistic statements coming from German Chancellor Olaf Scholz saying a final draft of the deal is on the table. And there's only a few more things that need to be worked out. So certainly some optimistic signs, but again, no one's celebrating here in Tehran just yet.
Reza, if a deal is reached, what do you think it could actually look like?
Stuart, it's hard to say at this point. We can assume if the deal is revived, it will address some of the demands on both sides. Iran, for its part, they want guarantees from Washington that the next U.S. administration, if it is a Republican administration, is not going to pull out of the deal like President Donald Trump did. Iran also wants sanctions lifted. Previously, they said want all sanctions lifted, but there's signs that they will agree to sanctions being lifted in stages. And for its part, Washington wants Iran to reverse its advancements in its nuclear program, and it wants Iran to agree to discuss other regional issues. So again, if the deal is revived, if an agreement is reached, we can assume that some of these things will be addressed in it.
Reza, thanks very much. Reza Sayar, correspondent, talking to us there from Tehran.
Latest news. U.S. restores sanctions waiver to Iran with nuclear talks in final phase. Reuters, dated February 4th, 2022. President Biden's administration last Friday restored sanctions waivers to Iran to allow international nuclear cooperation projects as indirect American-Iranian talks on reviving the 2015 international nuclear deal with Tehran enters the final stretch. The waivers had allowed Russian, Chinese, and European companies to carry out non-proliferation work to effectively make it harder for Iranian nuclear sites to be used for weapons development. The waivers were rescinded by the United States in 2019 and 2020 under former President Trump, who pulled out of the nuclear agreement. The indirect talks are aimed at having the United States return to the agreement and Iran resume compliance. The agreement was reached under former President Barack Obama, and Biden has pledged to try to bring the United States back in it. State Department has sent a report signed by Secretary of State Antony Blinken to Congress explaining that restoring the waivers will help the talks in Vienna on returning to the deal reached between Iran and a group of countries, including China, France, Germany, Russia, Britain, and the United States. The agreement is formally called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. According to the report, a copy of which Reuters had seen, quote, the waiver with respect to these activities is designed to facilitate discussions that would help to close a deal on a mutual return to full implementation of the JCPOA and lay the groundwork for Iran's return to performance of its JCPOA commitments. It is also designed to serve U.S. non-proliferation and nuclear safety interests and constrain Iran's nuclear activities. It is being issued as a matter of policy discretion with these objectives in mind and not pursuant to a commitment or as part of a quid pro quo, end quote. The activities, according to the report, include redesign of Iran's Arak heavy water reactor, the preparation and modification of its Fordo facility for stable isotope production operations, training and services related to the Bushehr nuclear power plant, among several other things. The United States and Iran have held 8 rounds of indirect talks in Vienna since April, aimed at reinstating the pact that lifted sanctions against Tehran in exchange for restrictions on its nuclear program. There has been no formal announcement on when the 9th round would start, but expectations intensified that it could be next week. After Trump pulled the United States out of the deal in 2018 and reimposed harsh sanctions, Iran gradually started violating the pact's nuclear curbs. Western diplomats now worry that its nuclear advancement leaves a very narrow window to return to the deal. The latest talks in Vienna were among the most intensive that we had to date, a U.S. official told reporters on Monday, speaking on condition of anonymity. The official stated there had been some progress in narrowing down the list of differences, and that now is the time for political decisions. The waiver was needed to allow for technical discussions that were key to the talks about a return to the deal, said a senior State Department official who spoke to reporters on condition of anonymity. The official added that restoring the waiver was not a signal that the United States was on the verge of reaching an understanding to return to the deal. Eurasia Group analyst Henry Rome said the restoring of the waiver is a modest sign of movement. The waivers are less a goodwill gesture or a concession to Iran, but rather technical steps that are probably aimed at ensuring implementation. Discussions can go forward in Vienna, Rome said. Headliner, Iran's supreme leader, Biden, Trump have tarnished reputation of the United States. Dated February 8th, 2022. Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei this week blasted President Biden and former President Trump, saying the two administrations have tarnished the reputation of the United States. He went on to say, these days, the U.S. is being hit in ways it never computed. The two American presidents, the current and former heads of state, have joined hands to tarnish the image of the United States, according to a report by Iranian news agency, the IRNA, on Tuesday. Though Khamenei did not further elaborate, his comments mark a rare direct criticism of the U.S. presidents. Today, Iran and the U.S. held indirect talks in Vienna in an effort to revive a nuclear deal that was initially enacted in 2015. Iran's top security official, Ali Shakami, warned in a tweet that the path to negotiations will not be smooth should the Biden administration continue on with a maximum pressure campaign Trump previously launched against Iran. Continuing maximum pressure against Iran, current U.S. administration has so far tried to meet the goals that Trump failed to achieve through bullying by making unsupported promises. With this, Washington's illusions, the path to negotiations will not be smooth, he wrote. Neither side has yet come to an agreement on a nuclear deal, Reuters has reported. Meanwhile, the Trump administration just Friday restored some sanctions relief to Iran's atomic program as talks aim to salvaging the nuclear deal. And that's the latest news. And now my thoughts. U.S. and Iran's history can go back decades. And I think the moment of the recent conflict come from the Syrian war and conflict in the country, the Iranians and their proxy army, the Hezbollah out of Lebanon, have been fighting against the Salafi jihadists like the Islamic State, Jabhat al-Nusra, and other al-Qaeda affiliates in support of the Assad administration. The United States had previously supported the jihadists through a covert CIA program called Timber Sycamore, in which it was supported by Jordan and Israel, with Saudi financing. And because of this, the Soviets and Iranians, as well as the proxy armies in Turkey who are against the Erdogan government, together have soundly defeated the jihadists in Syria. Now, there are certain groups that are languishing in the country, but these networks have been diminished greatly with the US military air attacks, as well as Soviet air attacks as of late. In 2017, Trump had ended the covert program. Meanwhile, the tensions between Iran, the US, and Israel accelerated after the program had ended. And it really accelerated with the assassination of General Soleimani. He was killed during a drone strike. Soleimani was the antagonist to the jihadists in Syria and Iraq. And with his death, the Iranians made it a promise to attack or kill then President Trump. In fact, just recently they made a video, which is silly in its own right, because it was aimed at Trump. Meanwhile, Biden's the president, but it showed this cartoon video, and his computer-generated video of a little Jeep or vehicle driving and shooting a drone strike at a missile strike at Donald Trump, who's playing golf. Now, Iran is a proud country, and when the assassination of Soleimani happened, it put Qasem Soleimani. It really put a dent in the Iranian military. Immediately after he was killed, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Kelly Craft wrote a letter to the United Nations Security Council in which he said the act was of self-defense because the United States had claimed that the Iranian military were attacking U.S. installations in Iraq. And of course, you have to take things with a grain of salt. Trump then decided to pull the United States out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was implemented under Obama. And he did this in May of 2018, before Soleimani was assassinated. And by doing this, he also imposed economic sanctions on Iran that was effective for a couple of months until November. By doing this, it inflamed tensions. And by doing this, it really put pressure on Iran. Economic sanctions are really a war crime, but they're not designated as one because the United States doesn't care about international law. They're not part of the Roman statutes. They're not part of the Hague or international community. Neither is Israel, neither is Iraq, neither is North Korea, and 3 other countries. However, they don't abide by international rule and don't abide by international law. They can get away with stuff like this. And that's the reason why the United States is the leader when it comes to covert intelligence operations which subvert countries, not just in the Middle East, but in Central America in the 70s, and can have the CIA to conduct coups through civil wars by antagonizing the opposition or infiltrating the opposition, like we saw with Iran in 1953 under Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, which gave us Reza Pahlavi, who was a Western-backed leader for years, over 20. So there's a long history. Now, with the recent talks in Vienna, I think it's hypocritical, to be quite honest with you, that the United States is actually telling Iran to curtail its enrichment of uranium. Meanwhile, the United States has a number of nuclear weapons. It is, as of 2020, if we're going to go by the National Nuclear Security Administration, as of 2020, the United States has a stockpile of 3,750 active and inactive nuclear warheads, plus approximately 2,000 warheads retired and awaiting dismantlement. By March of 2021, the United States paid out $2.5 billion in compensation, which was paid to U.S. citizens exposed to nuclear hazards as a result of the U.S. nuclear weapons program. Now, this is one of the recent incidents I have to bring up is the Marshall Islanders. Now, I don't know how many people live in there, but it is usually the country itself is independent, and it's near the equator in the Pacific, and it's part of the larger island group of Micronesia. And I'm on their Wikipedia now, and it says the country's population is 58,413 people. And usually this is an island where nuclear testing is done. And in 1998, they paid out $759 million for their exposure to U.S. nuclear testing. Lord knows how many people have been affected by this, which is generational, and how many people died. And yet, the United States is willing to lead the charge in regards to having nuclear sanctions on a country that's never used one and a country that never had one. Meanwhile, the US has had a history of using, they're the only country that has used 2 nuclear bombs, which killed hundreds of thousands in Japan of World War II. The amount of nuclear testing, which killed tens of thousands, probably, of the last 70 years. like I said, it's completely hypocritical. Meanwhile, Trump goes on Fox and he says that Iran is building a nuclear weapon and we need to put sanctions on them. And this is a madman. And this is what the new Republicans are. These are fanatics. This is not the days of yore, where we had presidents that basically were not as warmongering. Now, if you look back at history, the last couple of presidents have been Republican anyway, like Trump. Trump basically didn't create a new war. He just continued the Bush Obama ones. But just going back to 1953, you have from 53 forward, Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George Bush, W. Bush, and then Donald Trump. Now, when you hear these names and you go back to 1953, you are looking at a very sordid history of conflict. And it is really just and by the way, two of those presidents happen to be CIA directors. It is really just I'm sorry, Gerald Ford. Let me correct myself. Gerald Ford created the Commission on CIA Activities. He wasn't a director. However, George H.W. Bush was. The threat to hegemony isn't from really Democratic presidents. Democratic presidents are usually violators of privacy or intelligence matters. Bill Clinton, Obama, they wanted to implement covert operations inside the United States using the NSA and the CIA. And I think Obama was, in my lifetime, Obama the most egregious violator of privacy matters and civil liberties inside the United States that I've ever experienced under any president. The warrantless wiretapping of Americans, which started with Bush, but expanded exponentially under Obama, which allowed phone companies like AT&T and Verizon to give to the NSA all its clients without a warrant, their privacy data, text messages, phone calls. So when you look at past presidents, Republican presidents, they've been nothing but antagonists to the Middle East, especially under Reagan. And if a Republican president wins in 2024, which I think he's going to, the war that I'm worried about next is Iran. Because if that happens, it will not be Iraq 2.0. It will be the death of American hegemony in the region for a century and maybe future. And the people right now need to start paying attention about what is happening with the Republicans under fanatics like Tom Cotton, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Donald Trump and his son, Donald Trump Jr., and others who support the fanatic whims of an egotistical madman.